The whole roller coaster ride of Kiss to me was just like this jolly, crazy ride where I'm wearing makeup and dressed up as a superhero, playing guitar and having fun and meeting beautiful women along the way. I just never took the thing that seriously, even though we were like one of the biggest groups in the world. You know, and I still look back on it today and I go, wow, that was weird.
Welcome to episode 439 of the Thunder Underground podcast. Trent here as always. And this go around, we're going to be talking about Ace Frehley, as you could tell right there in the title. We're going to talk a bit about the man, the myth, the legend, the spaceman, the guitarist of Kiss. The original guitarist of Kiss, one of the founding members of one of the most important groups in the history of rock. As you all know by now, we lost Ace this past week. I would say it was a shocker to most people. I mean, a lot of people that, follow the news and follow rock music news and are pretty invested into it, knew that he was going through some stuff, but it wasn't really disclosed how bad it was. He had gotten in an accident, ended up in the hospital. The news that he was in ICU on life support didn't really come out and, to the public until the day that he unfortunately was announced later on that day that he had passed on. Lots of conflicting reports coming out that day as well, but that's all neither here nor there. That is just news outlets wanting to be the first to break news, right? Again, that's neither here nor there. We're here to talk about Ace Frehley. I'm not, I'll say this up front. I'm not a Kiss historian. I'm not the type of person that could sit here and talk to you about the intricacies of, the history of Kiss. I know a decent amount, but it's just because I'm a fan of the band. I'm just trying to tell you that I'm not. If you're listening to this because you're a diehard Kiss fan, I'm going to do my best to not say anything wrong. I know Kiss fans, there's fandoms out there that can get a little sticky at times. Kiss, Rush, Tool. Certain bands out there, they have their followers that are diehard about it, and you gotta love that. I love that about the Kiss Army. And like I said, I've been a fan since I'm a kid. I've never wavered on that. A million things could be said about a million different facets of Kiss, whether you're talking about the individual members themselves, whether you're talking about the music, whether you're talking about the different eras, the different players, the greatness of one player compared to another, the greatness of one era or point in history compared to another. But I think when it all comes down to it at the end of the day, I believe that the majority, and I'm talking a high majority and high 90 percentile, right, would all be in agreement that the beginnings, those early years, those early albums with the four original guys are where, the heart, the truth, and the greatness of this band and what they brought to the world of music, where it all... We're everybody should be in agreement of how important and how great that era was. And then once it goes past that, we could have a million discussions, but there's no reason to, because once it goes past that, the subject of today had moved on himself until, of course, the 90s. But, which I guess I should bring up because as a fan, I'll just tell you my story. How about that? My story as a fan of Ace and Kiss. My age, I'm in my late 40s now, for being transparent. So when I was like really, as all kids, you get into music when you're a little kid, but then when you really start adapting the types of music you really like, and whether you go head first into just like being a huge music dork or just being a person that casually listens to music, I chose the route of being a huge music dork, I guess, and went kind of head first there into the late 80s. Is when it kind of real got heavy for me, and it was all, the rock that was on the radio at the time, which was Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, Poison, all of that kind of stuff. And then that, of course, included me listening to the classic rock channels and the rock channels of the area, of course, it would still be playing stuff that came out in the, the 70s as well, because at that point we were, it was the equivalent of 10 years before, right? It was the equivalent of 2015 right now, which seems kind of weird to say. But hearing all that music on the radio, of course, I'd hear all the old Kiss music. Another thing, that I've talked about throughout the history of this podcast, Jason and I, when Jason used to do this with me, we would always talk about, kind of the history of like how we got into music. And Jason used to bring up how in the early to mid 90s, whenever, we were like in our I guess that would have been like 14 to 16, something like that, where you're just like really heavy into it. You've got all these bands that are like, that you've adapted as your favorite bands, and then you start diving into interviews with them or, looking into, stuff about these bands that you really like. When you learn about these bands, you learn what their influences are. And of course, a very common thread was Kiss. I believe Kiss and the Beatles were probably the two things that you would see the most. I mean, still to this day, I even really think it's an argument. I mean, of course, we all know this day and age, anything you say can turn into a fucking argument online. You can tell someone that your favorite color is purple, and they will argue with you that you're wrong about your favorite color. But anyway, there's bands and artists like Aerosmith and Led Zeppelin, The Who, Jimi Hendrix, AC/DC, the Rolling Stones, of course, a little bit later into the 70s, Van Halen, that are very significant and very important. And you would always hear those names as well when you're talking about Black Sabbath. Of course, I cannot leave Ozzy, Iommi, Geezer, and Ward out of that discussion, but you would always hear these names, and whenever you would find out influences of, bands you loved. When I say you, I'm talking about myself and my age group. If you're listening to this and you're older than me, of course you came up in this era. This is those bands you loved. But the point I'm trying to make is, as significant, as important as all these bands were in history, we know that Eddie Van Halen and Jimi Hendrix are two of, if not the two most, but, and probably in the top 5 of most important guitarists in rock and roll history for what they brought, for what the sound they brought, the changes they brought, the shift they put into music, all of that. While no one is ever going to mistake Ace Frehley for being as amazingly talented as Jimi Hendrix or Eddie Van Halen, if you do not put him in the same category of importance, you are 100% wrong, in my opinion. And I believe that to not just be an opinion, I believe that to be a fact. And you can talk about that what you want, but I assume if you're listening to this podcast, you would probably be in agreement with that, right? Ace Frehley and Kiss is more important to the history of rock, especially hard rock and metal, than I would think probably any other artist in history outside of the Beatles and Black Sabbath. And I would even put Kiss above Black Sabbath only because I think they had a wider range as far as, who was paying attention in the 70s and getting influenced by this to, want to become a musician, want to become a rock star themselves. And, it's a pretty fine line. Of course, Ozzy and Sabbath are monumentally important, the most important when it comes to heavy metal. And, we've seen over the past few months how important Ozzy was just on a grand scheme of his popularity, his importance in not just heavy metal, but in music culture and all that stuff. Ace Frehley, I believe, is very much the same way, obviously not on the extent of Ozzy in the pop culture sense. I mean on a scale of what the importance is to music, not just culture in general. Ace Frehley is up there because you saw it, as soon as he passed away, you saw guitarists, not just guitarists, musicians, vocalists. I saw drummers across the board in heavy metal, hard rock, rock and roll, pop, that were talking about how Ace, how watching Kiss in the 70s is what inspired them to want to be a larger than life rock star. It inspired them to want to be a musician. And then it all came down to, I wanted to be like Ace Frehley, and I picked up a broom, or I picked up a toy guitar, or I went out and scrounged and bought a cheap guitar at the pawn shop and stood in front of the mirror and acted like I'm Ace Frehley. There's very few other guitarists or musicians on this planet that you hear that exact statement about on a regular basis throughout the history, not just the past week since he's passed, but throughout history. Well before he passed, I've heard tons and tons and hundreds of times throughout interviews. I know it's happened on this podcast in itself, and like I said, when I was younger, growing up and, reading an interview, watching an interview, as soon as it come to influences, half the time, this man's name came up. So it cannot be overstated how important he was to the history of rock and roll. And it's just very cool to see, just how loved he was, by his peers that were massive fans of his, that became his peers and his friends, or even his peers that he didn't really know, that you see other musicians talking about. I got the chance to meet him once and he was super gracious. And that was also a common theme you would always see, is how, growing up, I was a huge Kiss fan, but my favorite member was Ace. And you would hear my favorite member as Ace more often than I think any of the other three of those original guys. And that goes a lot to saying what kind of person he was, because when you see in interviews, and we've seen a lot this past week, I've posted a few on my socials, and you see it shine throughout history, because I've seen interviews from the beginnings of the band in 74, throughout the 70s, and then saw some many throughout the 80s into the late 80s with Frehley's Comet, and then even more modern interviews in the past decade. And the common theme for the past 50 years was that this is just a good dude. Just seemed like a nice dude, that was playing rock and roll and having a great time doing it.
Tell me about your outfits. I mean, did you design your own outfits, all of you? And tell me what each outfit means. And I'll start with you, Ace.
Well,
that means a cucumber.
I think this outfit is self-explanatory. This is part of a kind of a V shape. This is my utility belt, and we don't want to go any below than my waist area, because that's reserved for concert payers.
I understand that. But, and after it's all over, they say, this is what we paid for.
And that's very great. I always feel short. I stole this from Flash Gordon, and, I have my cape.
But you're kind of like a spaceman, huh?
No, actually, I'm a plumber. On the side. Look.
Well, listen, I got a little piece of pipe backstage I'd like to have you work on.
Tell me about it. Oh, you won't let it, but I like
that. You old sweet talker, you. But I'll tell you, I read on the sheet that they gave me where they said that it's hard to get you out of your shell.
It's hard for me to talk. I'm very introverted.
Try to cheer down.
You can't not love that, as a fan, because they always say, never meet your heroes, because you'll be let down. But I feel like there's a lot of people out there that met Ace Frehley and were never let down, which of course is exactly what you want from one of your favorite musicians, right? But yeah, if for some reason you haven't kept up to date, Ace had a great album called 10,000 Volts that came out earlier last year. Steve Brown from Trickster, produced that and co-wrote a lot of it with him. Great stuff on there. In the past 7-8 years, late teens, he had a Origins album with a lot of cover songs, but it had a lot of collabs on there, like Slash and Mike McCready and some other guitarists joining him. That's a very cool one. But yeah, and Ace would just continue to go out there and play kick-ass rock and roll shows where he was playing his solo music, his Frehley's Comet music, and of course, many of the Kiss classics that, he had a hand in. Of course, most well known as far as the songs he sang, like Shock Me and Parasite. Also, in my opinion, Kiss's greatest song is Cold Gin, and Ace Frehley wrote that. Of course, didn't sing it on the original version. Gene sang it, and I believe, here's one of the things I was talking about. If you're a diehard Kiss fan, don't get offended if I'm wrong, but I believe I remember a story or an interview or something, years ago where one of them had said that Gene Simmons was trying to get Ace to sing it, the original version. And Ace just wasn't comfortable singing yet at that point, so that's why Gene sang the song. But again, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Not saying that's 100% fact, but I believe that to be fact. And on that note, one of the videos I posted in the past week was a clip of Ace playing Cold Gin acoustic on Headbangers Ball in 1989 with Skid Row. It's 3 of the members of Skid Row: Sebastian Bach, Rachel Bolan, and Dave Sabo. The 3 of them were playing, the 3 of them were hanging out with Ace. Ace playing acoustic guitar, and all 4 of them singing Cold Gin. So check that out if you had not seen that, or if you haven't seen it in a good 30, 35, 36 years. There's something to check out. But, I was fortunate enough to see Ace with Kiss whenever they did the reunion tour in 1996 that I believe went on. I believe Ace was in the band till about 2001 or 2 was when he left again. And I think Peter Criss had left a couple years prior to that. So there was a brief period in time where Ace Frehley was in the band while Eric Singer was playing the drums again. But I got to see the 4 original in 96. They played in Oklahoma City. So went down there and got the chance to check that out. And then many, many years later, I saw Ace about 3 times, I believe, solo. A couple of those times were at Rocklahoma. He played there in 2008 on the main stage, and then played again a few years ago. I believe it's 2019 maybe, on the stage under the big tent out there, the DEB concert stage, one of the proud sponsors of this podcast, DEB Concerts. But yeah, so, and I know that many Kiss diehards, could tell you about how they saw Ace and Kiss tons of times throughout the years, and, that's awesome if you're one of those people that got that chance. Drop in the comments or wherever you're listening to this, about your memories of seeing Ace live, or if you met him or anything like that. If you're a Kiss fan, Gene Simmons was actually on this podcast back in 2017. In the earlier days of this podcast has been going on since early 2015, so about 10 and a half years. But a couple years into it, we got pretty fortunate and had Gene Simmons on when he was playing a solo show in northern Oklahoma, where they were opening the first Rock and Brews casino. They had already done the restaurants, but they were doing the first themed casino, which I believe didn't actually open until this past year. I could be totally wrong on that as well, but I know it got put on hold for quite a while after that. But anyway, that was a pretty interesting, interview. I mean, I was extremely excited to do it and nerve-wracking, but it was one of the more memorable experiences of my life, just sitting down with a kind of a larger-than-life rock star like that of course has a reputation of his own, but he was extremely cool to me and Jason. So we had that great experience. And then not long after that, in episode 132, Bruce Kulick joined the podcast, and we talked a lot about the Revenge era, because when we're talking about Kiss, as much as I love Ace, Revenge has always kind of been my go-to Kiss album. And I know that might be blasphemous to old school Kiss fans, but again, Revenge came out when I was 15. So, I mean, you got to kind of look at it that way. That was not really my introduction to Kiss, because like I said earlier, I'd heard those classic songs on the radio a lot. But it was kind of my introduction to Kiss being, I guess, currently relevant on the radio, because, the songs like Domino and God Gave Rock and Roll to You Too and everything were getting played on the radio, and, they had the big Revenge tour and all that stuff. So that was, when they were trying to look hard and heavy, with the black leather and all that stuff in the early 90s to fit in with the heavy metal scene turning into the grunge scene and all that. But yeah, I mean, that was also a very cool experience. Absolutely love Bruce Kulick. And if you haven't seen, he's posted a great tribute to Ace Frehley this past week as well, as did Gene, Paul, Peter, Chris, of course. I saw Vinnie Vincent did as well. I know Tommy Thayer did, so I didn't notice one from Eric Singer, but I would be pretty surprised if he did not as well. But this has been one of those years, man. I mean, 2016 was a year where we lost a lot of significant people in the world of rock and music. It happens every year, but I'm talking about like highly significant, up to the, upper echelon of significance. Every year this is happening because, we're getting older, and all these people that were significant throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, of course, are getting older and passing away as well. In 2025, like I said, the significance of Ace Frehley, the monumental significance of Ozzy Osbourne, the monumental significance of Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and how important he was to music. There's very few people that you could put in a category with him on just how significant they were to pop music and rock music at the same time, kind of like the Beatles were. D'Angelo, passed away a couple weeks ago, and while that's not rock, obviously, and while he's not, an old school originator from the 60s and 70s in the world of R&B, he was extremely significant in the 90s and became a major force to the point that, there's so many artists out there now that were directly influenced by him. In the world of metal, Brent Hines, of course, is a massive name that we unfortunately lost this year. We lost David Roach from Junkyard, and then just a couple days after Ace Frehley passed away, we lost Sam Rivers of Limp Bizkit. And look at, just those last three I said, Brent Hines of Mastodon, David Roach of Junkyard, Sam Rivers of Limp Bizkit. These are three wildly different artists from three wildly different styles of music. And, that's the thing that I've always loved about music, is that, you can love all this different kind of stuff, right? And that's why I've never had issues throughout the mid-90s whenever, grunge and alternative and all that stuff was huge, to tell people in school, I still love Poison, I still love Kiss, I didn't care, but I still loved all the other stuff that was going on. And, and when Limp Bizkit came out, that of course was pretty contentious, to some people that liked rock and metal, blew all that off because of the rap element. And like everybody is, you've got your stuff you love, and new stuff comes out, you're like, what the hell is this? I do that myself too with music that comes out these days, but there's also great music that comes out these days that's new stuff, so you got to keep checking it out. But, Sam Rivers, to talk about him for a couple minutes, that, Limp Bizkit really did something. They came out during the height of nu metal when, Korn had really already started to blow that thing up, I think, and Limp Bizkit came out just like right at the right time to like fit into there. And somehow, anybody that heard Limp Bizkit in 1998, did you expect that, 27 years later, we'd be talking about Limp Bizkit as a band that, goes out and headlines festivals, goes out and headlines, it fills up huge places on their own, still to this day. Yeah, they're a force in hard rock and metal, and they kind of transcended that nu metal, rap metal tag. And the heart of that sound, that bass, when you think of those hits, when you like, especially like Nookie, the whole intro line to Nookie is that bass. And Sam Rivers started this band. There was, Limp Bizkit is another band that, never really got talked about when people talk about, bands that are still out there with all their original members. And Limp Bizkit was that band and has continued to be that band. And if they continue to move forward after this, of course they won't be anymore, but they had the three guys that started this band were Fred Durst, John Otto, and Sam Rivers. And then they ended up finding Wes later, and then they got DJ Lethal in there later. And, they've remained together ever since. And Sam was a huge force in this sound, and a huge force in a sound that was a huge part of a changing shift in the tides of music. And to be able to, be a part of something that was a very pinpointed moment in time fad and transcend that to a point of, like I said, 25, 27 years later, they're out on the road opening for Metallica again, just like they did 25 years before on the Summer Sanitarium tour, whenever they were like super hot and like one of the big new bands that have been on the radio for the past 2 or 3 years. And here we are, they're doing it again because it's still relevant to people. And, they're a band that is a very divisive band to a lot of people, but again, I do not care. It's just one of those bands that I've always loved. And again, once you get to this point, even if you don't like someone's music, you got to represent and love them. Not love them, but you got to represent and show them love, I think, as human beings, especially when they pass on. And Sam Rivers, I never knew him. I met the guy a couple times way back in the day, like at meet and greets and stuff. Got him to sign CD covers for me, but when you see him in interviews, he comes off as one of those guys that just seemed like he would be your friend, just a cool dude to hang out with. Didn't seem like the quote unquote stuck up celebrity, none of that stuff. And again, there's tons of, videos out there floating around now since he passed on. But a huge shout out to, Limp Bizkit and all the friends and fans of Sam Rivers. All right, I just wanted to throw out a quick episode, just kind of talking a bit about the loss of Ace. And of course, they're talking about Sam Rivers a little bit as well. If you are a big fan of either of these guys, like I said earlier with Ace, drop, some comments wherever you're listening to this at. Give me a follow wherever you're listening at as well. Whether it's Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple, doesn't matter what it is. Like, follow, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Anytime you see a post, like, comment, share. That's a great, easy way to help this podcast. Follow on the socials, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. All have daily content, not comment. But it has content that you could comment on. How about that? And this past week has featured a lot of content about Ace Frehley and Sam Rivers. But there's daily content on there about current news, about historical dates, when albums came out, when events happened, funny stuff, random clips from movies or old interviews, whatever. It's all there. So it's a cool thing that's separate from these podcast interviews. It also features video clips from a lot of these episodes as well. So dig through that as well. If you dig back, there's 438 episodes previous to this. Earlier this week, Paolo, the bass player from Trivium, was on here. Frank Hannon from Tesla was on here for the 5th time about a week or two ago. Previous to that, we had Dizzy Reed on the podcast again for the 2nd time. Michael Kiske, the vocalist of Halloween, was on here recently. Mike Tramp of White Lion came back for the 2nd time. I've had on members of Nonpoint, Megadeth, Motley Crue, Three Doors Down, Breaking Benjamin, Leonard Skinner, Living Colour, Shinedown, Battlecross, Testament, Warrant, Queensryche, Twisted Sister, Journey, Deep Purple, and Vanilla Ice. I just thought it'd be funny if I ended it like, and Vanilla Ice, like that was some kind of definitive ending. But no, there's tons more stuff out there, and as you can tell, it ranges. It's mostly hard rock and heavy metal, but there's tons of, artists that range from the 70s up until very current and new artists, as well as some kind of offshoots throughout the years, such as Vanilla Ice. But yeah, just dig back through there. I really appreciate you listening. Like I said, if you're a Kiss fan, there was a couple of previous guests. And of course, a couple others I could mention. Todd Kearns has been on here, and I believe Todd Kearns, has played a lot with Ace Frehley. So that would have been a good thing to mention earlier. He was on here probably about a year and a half ago. I'm sure I've had some guys throughout the years and I'm not thinking of that. But if you're a fan of Kiss, like I said, Deep Purple, Guns N' Roses, a lot of those 80s bands, Dokken, Slaughter, Firehouse, Trickster, Warrant, Junkyard, Kicks, LA Guns, Queensryche, Twisted Sister, Bon Jovi have all had members on this podcast. So yeah, check all that out at thethunderunderground.com. Wherever you're listening right now, like I said, follow, like, subscribe, share, all that great shit as well. Coming very soon, we've got an episode with the vocalist and guitarist of the band Beast Eagle. And we've also got a big Ozzy Osbourne tribute episode that I've been slowly putting together over the past couple months. That'll be coming soon as well. And much more to announce as it happens. All right. As always, a huge thank you to my sponsors, DEB Concerts and Sunset Tattoo. And until next time.
Thunder Underground, y'all.